I will not take long to reach the truth, because at 97 you no longer waste time decorating your sentences. I lived most of my life as a careful performance. I wore the right smiles, spoke the expected words, followed the quiet map that others placed in my hands before I was even old enough to question it. And only now, when my hands tremble while pouring tea, and the years sit heavy in my bones, do I understand something that should have frightened me much earlier. I was living someone else's life. It did not feel like a lie at the time. That is the dangerous part. A false life rarely arrives dressed as a mistake. It comes disguised as duty, as love, as tradition, as the reasonable choice that everyone praises. When I was young, I believed approval was proof that I was on the right path. If people were proud of me, I assumed I must be becoming who I was meant to be. I did not know that a person can be deeply applauded and still be deeply misplaced. There is a certain silence that lives inside a person who has slowly drifted away from herself. It is not dramatic. It does not scream or collapse in public. It is softer than that. It is the silence of accepting what is given instead of discovering what is true. I married the man my family trusted. I chose the career that felt safe rather than the one that felt alive. I shaped my days around what was expected instead of what was calling me from somewhere deeper and more frightening. For decades, I convinced myself this was maturity. I told myself that real adults do not chase wild instincts or fragile dreams. Real adults endure. They compromise. They adjust their desires until they fit into the narrow rooms built by circumstance and culture. And so, I became very skilled at adjusting. I adjusted my voice. I adjusted my ambitions. I adjusted my definition of happiness until it was small enough to carry without disturbing anyone. From the outside, my life looked complete. There were photographs of birthdays, anniversaries, holidays filled with laughter. There were polite achievements, steady routines, predictable seasons. People often said I was fortunate. They called me strong. They called me wise. I accepted those words gratefully, never suspecting that strength can sometimes be another name for quiet surrender. But time has a way of peeling back the stories we tell ourselves. When you live long enough, you begin to notice the gap between the life you performed and the life that was waiting patiently inside you. At first, it appears as a faint discomfort. Later, it becomes a persistent question. And eventually, if you are very old and very honest, it becomes a realization that cannot be softened. I am speaking to you now from that realization, not from theory, not from books, not from youthful rebellion. I am speaking from the edge of a life that is almost finished. And I want you to understand this before the years carry you as far as they carried me. It is possible to be responsible, admired, and deeply mistaken all at once. And it is possible to wake up very late and see, with terrifying clarity, that the person you spent decades becoming was never entirely you. The realization did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It came the way most life-changing truths come, gradually, almost politely, as if it did not want to disturb the fragile peace I had constructed around myself. When I look back now, I can see the early signs clearly, but at the time they were easy to ignore. They felt like small discomforts, like brief waves of restlessness that any sensible woman should simply learn to control. In my 20s, there were mornings when I would wake with a strange heaviness in my chest. Nothing was wrong on the surface. My husband was kind in the predictable way of men who have decided what their lives will look like. Our home was orderly. My parents were proud. Society had given me a quiet nod of approval. Yet something inside me remained unsettled, like a bird tapping its wings against the bars of an invisible cage. I remember once standing in front of the mirror, adjusting my hair before a dinner party. I was wearing a dress chosen because it was appropriate, elegant, safe. As I looked at my reflection, a thought passed through my mind so quickly I almost missed it. Who is this woman trying so hard to be acceptable? I dismissed the thought immediately. I told myself that doubt was a luxury, and luxury was something practical people could not afford. That is how it begins, the slow disappearance. Not through tragedy or rebellion, but through quiet, repeated decisions to choose security over authenticity. Each time I silenced my instincts, I felt a small internal shift. Each time I ignored a longing that did not fit the expectations of others, something essential within me grew fainter. I did not notice the cumulative effect. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. We can grow used to almost any emotional climate, even one that gradually deprives us of ourselves. There were dreams I once carried like secret treasures. I wanted to travel alone, not as someone's wife or daughter, but as a curious soul searching for meaning. I wanted to study art, not because it would lead to a respectable career, but because colors and forms stirred something profound in me. I wanted to live in a way that felt like discovery rather than obligation. Instead, I became efficient at postponing these desires. I told myself there would be time later. Later became a comforting word, a promise that required no immediate courage. Years passed. Responsibilities multiplied. Children were born. Mortgages were signed. Calendars filled with duties that seemed urgent and undeniable. I learned to measure my worth by how well I fulfilled roles assigned to me. I became the reliable one, the composed one, the woman who never created unnecessary waves. People trusted me. They leaned on me. They admired my stability. What they did not see was the quiet erosion happening beneath that stability. There were evenings when the house finally grew silent, and I would sit alone in the kitchen, staring at the dim reflection of the window. In those moments, I sometimes felt like a stranger in my own life. I had the unsettling sense that I was watching someone else's story unfold, a story that was respectable and orderly, yet somehow lacking the pulse of genuine aliveness. I would quickly push the feeling aside. There were lunches to prepare, conversations to manage, expectations to uphold. Self-examination felt indulgent, almost dangerous. The world rewards those who conform skillfully. It offers reassurance, structure, a clear script to follow. For many years, I mistook this external harmony for internal fulfillment. I believed that if everything around me was functioning smoothly, then I must be content. I did not understand that contentment built entirely on compliance is fragile. It depends on continuous performance. It requires you to keep editing yourself until you become almost unrecognizable to your own heart. As I moved into middle age, the whispers inside me grew slightly louder. I would encounter women who had chosen unconventional paths, and something within me would ache with a mixture of admiration and envy. They seemed to inhabit their lives with a kind of fearless presence I had never cultivated. Instead of asking why their courage unsettled me, I judged them quietly. It was easier to believe they were irresponsible than to admit I was afraid. Fear was, in truth, the hidden architect of many of my decisions. I feared disappointing my parents. I feared instability. I feared being misunderstood. Most of all, I feared discovering that my deepest desires might lead me away from the comfortable identity I had spent years constructing. So I stayed. I stayed in routines that felt increasingly mechanical. I stayed in conversations that skimmed the surface of my thoughts. I stayed in a version of myself that was praised for being dependable, but never celebrated for being real. Time, however, does not negotiate. It moves forward with a quiet persistence that eventually forces every illusion into the light. By the time I reached my 70s, the pace of life began to slow just enough for reflection to slip through the cracks. Friends started to pass away. Children built lives far from mine. The roles that had once defined me began to dissolve, leaving behind a strange emptiness. Without the constant activity of serving others' expectations, I was confronted with a question I had postponed for decades. If I am not who I have been performing, then who am I? This question did not feel philosophical. It felt urgent and raw. I realized I had spent so much energy maintaining an image that I had neglected to cultivate an inner compass. I knew how to respond to others' needs with precision, but I did not know how to listen to my own truth. The habits of self-suppression had become second nature. Authenticity, which might have flourished if I had nourished it earlier, now felt like a foreign language I was struggling to remember. Looking back, I understand that identity does not vanish overnight. It fades through 1,000 subtle compromises. Each compromise seems harmless when viewed in isolation. Together, they can reshape an entire lifetime. I was not coerced into living someone else's life. I participated willingly, even gratefully, because the alternative required a courage I had not yet developed. If there is one secret I can share from this long, complicated journey, it is this: the greatest loss is not failure or hardship. The greatest loss is the gradual surrender of your inner voice. When you ignore it repeatedly, it does not fight you. It simply grows quieter. And one day, you may wake up, as I eventually did, and realize you have become an expert in meeting expectations, but a novice in understanding yourself. This is the foundation of my regret. Not that my life was outwardly unhappy, but that it was inwardly unexamined for far too long. I was present for every milestone, yet absent from the deeper unfolding of my own soul. I lived responsibly, respectfully, and almost entirely by borrowed definitions of what a good life should look like. And the most sobering part is this: I did not feel the full weight of that truth until most of my years were already behind me. The true awakening did not come from a grand event or a philosophical revelation. It arrived quietly, almost mercilessly, during an ordinary afternoon when I was 93 years old. I was sitting by the window of the small room I had moved into after my husband passed away. Outside, children were walking home from school, their laughter bright and careless, untouched by the weight of memory. I remember feeling an unexpected surge of envy, not for their youth, but for their unfinished lives. They still had time to become who they truly were. That thought unsettled me more than grief ever had. For months after his death, I had been occupied with practical matters. There were documents to organize, condolences to receive, routines to rebuild. Busyness protected me from reflection. But eventually, silence claimed its territory. Without the familiar structure of shared habits and obligations, I was left alone with myself in a way I had never experienced before. It was not loneliness in the conventional sense. It was confrontation. One evening, I opened an old wooden box that had traveled with me through every home I had lived in. Inside were letters, photographs, small sketches I had made as a girl. As I held those fragile pieces of the past, something inside me shifted. I saw, with painful clarity, the difference between the young woman I had once been and the person I had slowly shaped myself into. The girl in those sketches was curious, bold in her imagination, unafraid of unconventional dreams. The woman I became was composed, efficient, and deeply cautious. I began to ask myself questions I had avoided for decades. When did I start choosing approval over authenticity? At what point did practicality become my primary language? I searched for a single turning point, but found none. Instead, I discovered a pattern, a series of subtle adjustments that gradually redirected the course of my existence. It felt like watching a river that had been quietly diverted until it no longer resembled its original path. The realization was not accompanied by dramatic despair. It was more profound than that. It was a sober, almost clinical recognition that I had invested enormous energy in maintaining a life that did not fully belong to me. I had loved my family sincerely. I had fulfilled my responsibilities with dedication. Yet somewhere along the way, I had mistaken loyalty to others for loyalty to myself. This understanding changed the way I viewed my memories. Moments I once considered proof of success began to reveal hidden layers. I remembered the promotions I accepted without excitement, the social gatherings where my laughter felt rehearsed, the countless times I silenced a spontaneous impulse because it seemed impractical. None of these choices were catastrophic on their own. Together, they formed a quiet architecture of self-abandonment. There was also anger, not the explosive kind, but a deep, simmering frustration with my own compliance. I realized that fear had guided me more than wisdom. I had feared instability, judgment, and the unpredictable consequences of following an inner calling. In trying to protect myself from potential pain, I had unknowingly deprived myself of genuine aliveness. Safety, I discovered too late, can become a beautifully decorated cage. Yet alongside the regret, something unexpected emerged: compassion. I began to see my younger self not as weak or foolish, but as a product of her time and environment. She had done what she believed was necessary to survive and belong. Understanding this softened the harshness of my self-judgment. It allowed me to view my life with a gentler, more nuanced perspective. I had not been living a deliberate lie. I had been navigating a complex landscape without a clear map. In the years that followed this awakening, I attempted small acts of reclamation. At 94, I enrolled in a community art class. My hands were unsteady, my eyesight imperfect, yet the simple act of mixing colors felt like rediscovering a forgotten language. I traveled alone once, just a short train journey to a coastal town I had always dreamed of seeing. Walking along the quiet shoreline, I experienced a bittersweet freedom, the joy of finally listening to my own desires mixed with the sorrow of knowing how long I had postponed them. These late gestures did not erase the past, but they transformed my relationship with it. I stopped viewing my life as a fixed narrative of missed chances and began to see it as an evolving story, even in its final chapters. Authenticity, I learned, is not reserved for the young. It remains available to us as long as we are willing to face ourselves honestly. The tragedy is not that realization comes late. The tragedy is when it never comes at all. Still, I cannot pretend there were no nights of profound reckoning. I would lie awake, listening to the steady rhythm of my own breathing, and feel the immense weight of unchosen possibilities. Entire versions of myself had remained unexplored. Entire conversations with the world had gone unspoken. Time, once abundant and almost invisible, had become a tangible presence, pressing gently but insistently against my remaining days. In those quiet hours, I began to understand the true nature of identity. It is not a fixed role assigned by circumstance. It is a living process that requires continual attention and courage. When neglected, it does not disappear entirely, but it retreats into the background of our awareness, waiting patiently for recognition. My awakening at 93 was not a sudden transformation into a different person. It was a gradual return to a self I had once known intimately and then forgotten. If you are listening to me now, perhaps much younger than I am, I want you to recognize this subtle danger. You can live decades in a state of functional success while remaining emotionally disconnected from your authentic direction. Society may reward your consistency. Your loved ones may rely on your predictability. But beneath that stability, there can exist a silent longing that no external achievement can fully satisfy. I share this not to burden you with fear, but to offer clarity. The illusion of living someone else's life is sustained by habit and reinforced by praise. It dissolves only when you develop the courage to question the script you have inherited. For me, that courage arrived very late, carried on the fragile wings of solitude and reflection. By the time the illusion finally broke, most of my life had already been written. Yet even then, the truth brought a strange, luminous peace. The peace of finally seeing my own story without distortion. Now I am 97. My world has grown smaller in ways that are both humbling and clarifying. I walk more slowly. I forget simple things. Entire afternoons can pass in quiet contemplation. Yet my mind, in its strange late-season sharpness, sees life with a precision I never possessed when I was young and busy trying to be who I thought I should be. If I could gather all the decades I have lived and compress them into a single sentence for you, it would be this: a life can look complete from the outside and still feel unfinished from within. That is the truth I discovered too late. I fulfilled expectations with diligence. I honored traditions with sincerity. I loved people deeply and was loved in return. But for most of my years, I did not fully honor the person I was meant to become. I am not telling you this so that you reject responsibility or abandon those who depend on you. Real life is not built on reckless self-indulgence. It is built on balance, a delicate, evolving conversation between duty and authenticity. My mistake was not that I cared about others. My mistake was that I gradually erased myself in the process. I believed that sacrifice was always noble, that endurance was always virtuous, that silence was always strength. Only with age did I understand that a person who never listens to her own truth eventually loses the ability to recognize it. Time is not as generous as it appears when you are young. In your 20s, years feel like vast landscapes waiting to be explored. In your 40s, they become structured pathways marked by obligations. In your 70s, they begin to resemble a narrowing corridor. And by the time you reach my age, you can see the end of that corridor with startling clarity. It is not frightening in the way people imagine. What is frightening is the realization that certain doors along the way were never opened simply because you were too careful to try. I have come to believe that authenticity is not a dramatic declaration made once in a lifetime. It is a quiet, daily practice. It is the courage to admit when something feels misaligned. It is the willingness to ask difficult questions about the roles you play and the dreams you postpone. It is the discipline to create small spaces in your routine where your own voice can be heard without interruption. These acts may seem insignificant at first, but over time they shape the architecture of a life that truly belongs to you. Do not wait for a crisis or an advanced age to begin this process. Reflection should not be reserved for the final chapters. If you listen carefully, your inner compass is already offering subtle guidance. It appears as curiosity, as discomfort, as a persistent attraction to paths that feel uncertain but meaningful. Pay attention to these signals. They are not distractions from your responsibilities. They are invitations to live with greater integrity. I also want you to release the illusion that you must choose between being loved and being authentic. For many years, I believed that expressing my deeper desires would isolate me, that stepping outside established expectations would cause irreversible damage. What I see now is that genuine connection grows stronger when it is rooted in honesty. People may resist your changes at first, especially if they are accustomed to a predictable version of you. But in the long run, a life lived truthfully creates relationships that are more resilient and more real. As I sit here, surrounded by memories that stretch across nearly a century, I do not feel only regret. I feel gratitude for the clarity that finally arrived, even if it came late. This awareness has given my remaining days a quiet depth I never experienced before. Simple moments, the warmth of sunlight on my hands, the sound of distant conversation, the act of placing color on paper, now carry a significance that once eluded me. Authenticity, I have learned, transforms even ordinary experiences into something profoundly meaningful. You still have time. That is the greatest difference between us. Your story is still unfolding, still flexible, still responsive to the choices you make today. Do not let comfort become your only compass. Do not let fear disguise itself as wisdom. And above all, do not postpone your own becoming until the years have quietly rearranged your possibilities. If my long life can offer you anything of value, let it be this gentle warning and this hopeful reassurance. It is never too early to live as yourself, and it is never entirely too late to begin. I am 97, and at last I understand who has been speaking softly inside me all along. My only wish is that you hear your own voice much sooner.